Hello, and welcome to another Badhumanist Thoughts. In this video, I'm going to be talking about talent trees, talent choices, and what makes a good talent tree. So this video is going to be kind of inspired by a recent blue post by Blizzard on Affliction Warlocks. In fact, they've been doing a number of these kind of blue post feedbacks for a number of classes for the beta. But I think the one that they talked about in the Affliction lock was interesting because they mentioned about general talent tree layouts. And I'm going to kind of read this almost word for word. So it says it's a list of competing, sometimes contradictory desires, all of which are valid to some degree. So here's some things that people oftentimes say. All talents in a row should be equal. Some talents should be better in some situations. Talents on the same row shouldn't clearly be better in single target or AoE or verse talents on the same row. Difficult to use talents should be a little more rewarding than easy to use talents. Talents shouldn't be too similar to each other. Players should be allowed to pick whatever talent they find the most fun. The strongest talent should probably be the most fun one, and so on. So you can see that since Blizzard switched from the old, long talent tree systems where you would have multiple choice and could put multiple points into a single talent to this kind of, okay, bucket, pick the ones you kind of want in each row, there's been people who have complained about how the loss of, the ability to hybrid, the loss of the ability to actually really, fine tune the spec, if you will. And so I want to kind of spend a little bit talking about what I think, after going through a number of these classes, really does make for a good talent tree. Now, I will admit that the best talent tree implementation that I've ever seen in MMO, I will argue my hardest for actually for Rift. I like the fact that the soul system allowed you to pick, among any one of up to the beginning 10 different trees, pick any three, and then you could put your points into there. And also the fact that the more points you put in, you got rewarded by talents in the bottom. I really like that ability. It really did allow for true hybriding. And again, I do find that the ability to kind of min-max in that system was a lot of fun. Now, speaking of WoW, however, while I definitely did enjoy the old ones, I understand why Blizzard changed. There really was a point to where uh, there would be no reason to not just put all three in something or all two in something. And very rarely did you ever not. The only cases when you wouldn't possibly were actually things like proc chances, where the increase from a 30% to a 45% chance wasn't worth that point as opposed to something else. Um, and so, in general, on those things, they should have just tuned that better anyway. So, I don't mind the current kind of talent system in this iteration, but I do think that some of the complaints people have are valid in the sense that uh, we've ended up in a lot of times with specs that had cookie cutter builds, no matter what, right? And a lot of that I think comes down to the general way that if you want to play the game competitively, there are going to be better and worse ways of playing. Um, if your goal in the game is to do the most DPS, then whatever does that will be best. And so I think that the mathematical element of the game does hurt, and oftentimes the case. And I think that oftentimes we need to realize that when we're dealing with simulations, we're dealing with situations where we're talking about fine-tuned differences, right? The difference sometimes between one build and another build are so close together that an actual human wouldn't be able to do a difference in a true kind of like setting. Um, if you actually do 100 iterations, 100, raid bosses over and over again, and a human on two different builds, you probably would have very similar averages. But yet, because one is mathematically more valuable or more powerful than the other one, that's what people go with. And so I do feel that this, of course, limits their abilities, which comes to that first idea of all talent on a row should be equal, right? This ideology is the idea that, okay, in a given row, I just have different flavors of the same thing. So let's take, for example, this 90 row on the Warlock here, the Aflock. So you have Grimoire Sacrifice, you have Haunt, and you have Shadow Embrace. If you look at these, all of these are ways of basically giving you a percent increase in damage, right? Shadow Embrace, Shadow Bolt applies Embrace, increasing your damage dealt by 3%, stacking 3 times. Haunt is a dot that again increases your damage dealt by 10% for 15 seconds. Sacrifice, again, is a way to sacrifice your pet, and then it causes all your spells to do additional damage. So ideally, you could mathematically kind of like balance these. Now, I think it's actually very hard to do because of the multitude of situations that raiders find themselves in. Again, on a dummy, sure, they might be even, but on a number of given raid fights, maybe not. But even if it's that you get them within 1% of each other, where it's not going to matter the difference, the idea here would be, okay, you get to pick and choose your playstyle. Do you want to manage a dot? Do you want to manage a stacking debuff, or do you want just kind of a passive, get rid of your pet, get extra damage? And so that would be, I think, a very good, fair way of kind of approaching this, right? Because you get to pick and choose how you want to play, and it doesn't affect your viability. For example, again, if they could balance them mathematically, that's a pretty big if. Now, the next idea comes from this idea that some talent should be better in some situations. So for this, you might be able to think about cases where, let's see if I can actually find that talent. Here we go. Right, let's look at the 100 row here. So you have Dark Soul Misery, and I'm specifically going to look at Creeping Death. Now, Creeping Death, and I've talked about this in my Affliction video earlier, simply just makes your dots deal damage faster. So the total damage they do doesn't change. It just happens over less time. So again, it's a neutral DPS with an increase in damage per... it's a neutral damage per execute time with an increase in DPS, because the amount of time it takes to do all the damage is shorter. So this is clearly better in cases where the target might die before the dot would get all of its damage off. So with dots, that was always the one thing you have to worry about is, okay, if I'm going to apply this dot, am I going to get the full value of it or not? Because if not, then I lose some of that execute damage. So this obviously is clearly better in situations where you have a lot of adds or things that have lower health pools that are going to clearly die faster. Whereas like Dark Soul Misery doesn't have that necessarily advantage. It's just a cooldown, gives you increased haste by 30% for 20 seconds, right? This is good in a multitude of situations, right? It doesn't just have that one niche of, if you're in Mythic Plus or you're on a raid boss where you have a lot of adds that are going to die quick and you want to get some damage off on them, this is very valuable because while, it's rare for a mob in a Mythic Plus to last the entire duration of, 18 seconds, it's a lot easier for it to last maybe 10 seconds. And again, the idea here being you're going to get more value out of your dots because more of their damage would actually do damage before the target died. So again, another kind of situation where, okay, it's a situational thing. If you're somebody who likes to switch your talents fight to fight and find that playing different styles is enjoyable, you would like that kind of design, right? Now, other people might say, no, that's too much to deal with. I don't have to worry about having different rotations or different play styles based upon different fights. I don't have to worry about carrying around a million tomes on me and be switching in between, and I know I'm going to forget, and I'm like, oh crap, I've had the wrong talent. We've all been there before. And so, I understand that people would not like that idea, but some people do. Some people are like, no, that's how I keep the game fresh, right? By playing different builds, by playing different play styles, and different kind of boss fights, it keeps the game engaging. So that's another example in the same tree of this kind of philosophy. Now the next one says talents in the same row shouldn't be clearly better in single target or AoE versus other talents on the same row. So this again is almost in contradiction of that. The idea that no, I should have a talent that is best in the row, right? Or it should be no better or no worse than any other talent for any situation, right? That would kind of go back here. And of course, I would even argue the 90 row has advantages because, for example, this is on a single target, this is on a single target, this just does all damage in general. So again, Grimoire Sacrifice might be better in an AoE situation because this is only on a single target, as well as this is only on a single target. But the idea there being that in a single row, if I pick a talent, it should not, shouldn't need to change it going back and forth. So this kind of lines up more with those people who disagree with the better in some situations idea, with the idea that no, on a given row, I should have a talent that is the talent that I want to take. Maybe it's a playstyle choice, right? Where I want to pick this talent because I enjoy the playstyle, and I shouldn't have to worry about changing it, whether I'm in AoE or in a single target. Again, seems kind of valid. Again, I would probably not agree with this. I tend to actually like a bit of variation. I especially like variation, and I am okay with the idea that if the fight's more AoE, I can go one build versus more single target another build. I'm okay with that kind of idea. Other people might not, and in that case, I can understand that idea. The next one here says difficult to use talents should be more rewarding than easy to use talents. And I'm going to actually expand this, because I think in this case, they're not really talking about talents specifically. What they're really talking about here is play styles. I'm going to use a couple of examples here. And the one that I'm going to use, because it's one that I have experience with, was both Shadow Priest and Survival Hunter in Legion. So Survival Hunter, I think, was famous for being a super high APM, super high difficulty spec to play, for the most part, that really wasn't that rewarding. So you would have, multiple debuffs to be keeping up. You had, you're in melee, you're moving around, you have a bunch of dots, you have a mongoose window to worry about. Your rotation would change halfway through. It was very complicated, and yet you didn't see great damage. And I agree with this sense where I'm okay that Beastmaster exists. I'm okay that Arcane Mage exists. I'm okay that there's specs that have less buttons, have lower APM, and are maybe slower, maybe more methodical to play. But I want to feel rewarded for playing better. And that I think is the important thing, where if I'm able to maintain a perfect rotation on survival, which not everyone probably could, I want to be rewarded. What I'm basically saying here is I would like to see 50th percentile balanced. Okay? I would think the average player on each spec should be doing about the same damage. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is if you are going to have playstyles that are, what I would argue, objectively more complicated, um, I should be able to be rewarded. The idea here being that not everybody's going to get that, right? That yes, the best player is going to be able to min-max that spec and make it viable, but your average player is not going to take advantage of that. I think on average, if all the specs were even, again, you look in the 50 percentile-ish on like World of Logs or Warcraft Logs, you'll see that most specs should be within margin of error. However, when you start getting higher up there in the 90th percentile and such, I'm okay seeing some deviance, especially fight to fight, as some specs might be better on some fights and better and worse on others. But the idea here being that the specs that really reward those top end players actually reward them. The fact that again you could have a spec that was relatively straightforward, topping the meters consistently, is not surprising, but again I think it leads people to that direction. If there's a spec that when the average person plays it, they're not able to do well in, they might not go to it. But again, it can still be attracted to that one individual who really can get the most out of it, who can really kind of get the all the little juices out of that spec. And I think that might actually be encouraging. So again, you'll see that these super powerful specs are not played by everybody because the super powerful specs require a high skill level to actually play at that level. And I think that that kind of balancing, where you're balancing more around overall play style and like the basically the probability of somebody able to achieve a DPS level, might be a bit more interesting than just balancing the specs. If you play each spec perfectly, this is where the balance is, because that will always encourage people to play easier specs because the margin of error will be less, right? If Beastmaster Hunter and Survival Hunter did the same DPS, I would be able to maintain a higher average in Beastmaster because the chances of messing up are lower, right? There's less opportunity for me to mess up. There's less things that are punishing to me. Whereas if I played Survival, even if I could do maybe a little bit more DPS in Beastmaster, the chances of me actually achieving that consistently might not be that great. So why play Survival? And I think that that's, again, why we end up seeing some specs fall by the wayside. Is because specs that are easy and competitive, people will play. Specs that are a little bit harder, but again, reward you for that, will be played. Specs that are challenging and difficult, but don't reward you, don't get played. So again, I think if Blizzard wants to fix some of those issues with certain specs being played, Survival being one they've even highlighted themselves as a spec like this, they need to make sure that it's okay to make a more complicated spec. People will enjoy a complicated spec, but it has to be competitive. You have to be rewarded for your competency. Alright, next, talent shouldn't be too similar to each other. Now this I actually agree with, and what I mean by that, and I'm trying to think of any good example here on this tree, but I don't like it when it's basically three versions of the same thing. So for example, while these all give you damage increase, their gameplay style is different, so I'm okay with that. But if you were to basically have, let's say, just like 3 different dots that just had different spell looks, but were basically affected the same thing, that'd be boring. It's basically like, oh, what color do I want to play? That's not the kind of choice that I'm looking for. So again, or another example is cases where you just have like passives, right? A whole row of passives, and it's like, oh, this gives me more passive damage, more passive damage, passive damage. It might be in different ways, but if at the end of the day, the effect is the same of all of them, and I don't feel any gameplay difference, right? My rotation doesn't change, I don't change my stat priorities, but everything stays the same, my damage goes up, kind of boring. So again, I actually really do agree, and I think that in general that's one that is easy to implement. I don't think it really contradicts with many of the other things that Blizzard is looking at here. Next one, players should be able to pick whatever talent they find most fun. So this quote is a bit misleading, because if you really think about it, people can pick whatever talent they find is most fun. They just have to pay the consequence of maybe playing a subpar spec or subpar talent utilization, right? So what they really mean here is that players should be able to pick whatever talent they find most fun and be competitive and be viable. That's what they really mean when they say that. And again, this goes back to the first one of all talents on a row should be equal. If you have a situation where all talents on a row are equal, but different gameplay versions, that would give you that opportunity where you can pick the one that you find personally be the most fun and it would still be viable. So you can start to see how I think some of these are not as contradictory as Blizzard might have assumed. There definitely are some, and again, a big contradiction I'll reiterate at the very end here. But a lot of these, I think, do align themselves with one another in certain ways when you kind of think of the perspective that they're trying to get at. The next one here is one that is obviously going to be a bit contradicting to the last one, which is the strongest talent should probably be the fun one. So two problems here. A, you're comparing a subjective with an objective measure. So strongest is going to mean best DPS, best HPS, best survivability, right? It's going to have a meaning. That's what you mean by strongest talent, right? An objectable measure, a measure, something you can actually look at and find in those ways. Fun, you can't measure fun in an objective way. What is fun to me might be miserable to you. Again, my background's in philosophy. A lot of things that I find fun, many people find very boring. I'm okay with that. So this idea, this ideology is just one that is flawed from the very beginning. Because you can't measure these two things in equal ways. What is most fun could be different. Which again goes back to what you really should be saying is no, all talents on the road should be equal. Because then you can again, like in the last case, pick the one that's most fun and it's still technically the strongest. Remember, if I have three talents and they all do the same DPS, they are all technically the strongest. You have a tie, basically, of strongest. That is technically correct. So, yes, that's what, in a sense, that really would mean. To enable this to be true, the strongest talent should probably be the most fun one. The only way to truly accomplish that and make sure that it's true for everybody is to have all talents on the road be equal. Have them be different. Have them be different ways of engaging you so that you can pick the one you most enjoy, but yet again, find that they all end up being equal in damage-wise. So you never feel as if you're not able to pick the most viable one. Now, some people might argue, what I mean by this is the strongest talent should be the one that's most complicated, right? Where again, they are confusing fun with complicated, right? Or requires the most, APM, or whatever kind of actual measure, right? If you're going to make a measurement thing, you have to have two things that can actually be measured. So if you're going to say strongest, you better say something that can also measure as well. So yes, if you want to say the strongest talent should be the one that requires the most APM, I'm absolutely okay with that. And again, that would go back to the idea that of difficult to use talents should be more rewarding than the easy to use ones. And again, as I talked about, difficult rotations should be more rewarding than easier rotations at the max level. So again, if you mean that when you read that quote, then again I can still agree with you there. And again, what I would say is, I already talked about that previously. Yes, if it's a higher APM, is more complicated, if it requires a higher skill level to achieve, then yes, that should be stronger, and I'm okay with it being stronger than the other on the row. As long as the average player, they're about even. I think that should be the goal, right? If I have 3 talents to choose, and the average player, the 50th percentile, can pick either any of those talents and do the same, and again, the higher skilled players can then be rewarded for taking more APM, more complicated, more complex rotations, talents. I'm okay with that. So what really is the contradiction here, right? They list a bunch of things and they mention how they're competing, sometimes contradictory. I think the only real contradiction comes down to this idea, which really comes down to, do we want balance across the row, or do we want utility across the row? Do we basically want you to be able to pick any talent layout you want and it be just as viable in any situation, or do we want a situation where there is a better build, but the better build has to do with the playstyle, right? Where if I'm going into Mythic Plus, I have choices for how to play Mythic Plus, but they are going to be different than the choices that I would make for raiding, for example, or PvP being different than raiding. So what that means is you would need to have multiple options that were viable in multiple gameplays, or at least have certain rows that allow choice for different gameplays. So for example, a lot of talent trees that I've noticed have basically what I would call an AoE row, right? So for example, the 60 row here, you have the Seeds, you have Phantom Singularity, and you have Vile Taint. So in a row like this, I would be okay if there's one talent that was clearly better for raiding, right? That this is clearly the one that is the better option for raiding. For most encounters, of course, there might of course be a more heavy AOE encounter that would change this up. But for Mythic Plus, you can actually pick any of the three or any two of the three, right? Something like that. Maybe you have one that is a sense of, okay, this is clearly the better one uh, for rating, but you could pick either of the other two, and they're both equal, and they're different gameplays. Or maybe, if you want to get really technical with it, this talent is better for these dungeons or these affixes, whereas this talent is better for those affixes. We actually saw that in Legion, where depending on the affix, you might go different builds. Again, I play the healer. There definitely were cases where if I was a disc priest, I play a disc priest, and I was going on a high thing, I would probably want to take cow. I want to be able to have those shields to stack up to be able to kind of mitigate the incoming damage. So I didn't mind that. I didn't mind the idea that as affixes changes, as my Mythic Plus level changed, I changed my talents accordingly. So I'm okay with that, right? That would be, I think, a very fun and engaging way where, yes, different gameplay styles always have choice. So in every row, depending on the gameplay, you have some choice. Maybe not row to row, but overall, where there's more than one build that is viable for a given task. And while there might always be one slightly more or less, as long as it's not overly general, right? It's not like for all Mythic Plus, you only play with these talents. That's it. No other choices. But instead, for Mythic Plus, there really are 2 to 3 different ways of play, different kind of talent layouts. They're all basically competitive. Some may be a little bit better here, a little bit better there. But they're within margin of error. And again, a lot of it comes down to your playability. Let's not forget that I think a lot of people complain about talents that are not competitive, but the problem not is that they actually aren't balanced competitively, but they just can't play them very well, right? So again, if somebody is struggling to play a talent layout well, it's not the talent layout's fault, it's your fault. So keep that in mind as well. So that, I think, to me is kind of like a possible solution where as long as you are okay with this idea of playing different styles for different encounters, that would be one way of achieving it. Now again, the actual contradiction here is no. I want to be able to simply pick anything I want and it be viable anywhere I go. And in general, I understand the simplicity. I understand that some people like the idea of set and forget. I pick a talent set, I learn how to play it really well, and then I just go and do the different things in the world. I just really think that if you're somebody who's playing the game as often as a lot of very hardcore players do, that can't help but get boring. And maybe you augment it by playing different classes, different specs, right? So you inside the spec, you're not looking for variation. You get your variation from playing different specs. I can understand that. But in general, I like the idea to kind of be able to mix and max. I like the idea of being able to min-max around something. And so, personally, again, I don't think that would end up with a very engaging play style. For a good chunk of the community, even for those who are a bit more casual, I think the ability to, again, have some freedom of choice, but have that freedom somewhat limited by the encounter you're doing, is okay. So those are some of my thoughts on the talents. Again, I thought it was very interesting that Blizzard actually came out with this, because it was something that I've been thinking about on my own anyway, going through all the different talent trees and these different specs, and kind of seeing some similarities and differences among what talent to choose. There were some cases where it was like a no-brainer, like why would anyone pick this kind of a thing, which always sucks. Other times it's kind of like, oh, okay, it's kind of like pick your own poison here. Which one do you want to play? It changed your gameplay a little bit, but overall they're about equal. And so by thinking about that and having Blizzard actually post something very explicit about here's some of the things that we're thinking about, here's some of the complaints or some of the ideas we're trying to balance around, I thought I might kind of address this. So again, sorry for not being able to get a actual class video out. I'm in the process of doing Warrior, and of course with the big update onto the beta, which affected Warrior, so I have to kind of redo a lot of my stuff there. So I thought in the meantime I would get this video out, kind of giving my thoughts on what makes specs interesting and engaging, what kind of talent trees should we be looking for, and what I actually think the talent tree layout might be. And again, I really do think that you have two different thought processes. One is basically everything balanced on a single row, pick what you want. The other one being they're balanced, but balanced around playstyles, right? You have a AoE type playstyle that you can pick choices between, and they're balanced for AoE, and you have a more single target rating environment talent set. Again, you have options, you have choices, but again, they're balanced around that, where you're not going to have the same talent layout for rating as you would for Mythic Plus, as you would for PvP. And I think that is perfectly fine, and again, would actually lead to having some choice, no true cookie cutter spec, but also allowing some variability between the different kind of gameplays and allow you to kind of explore different elements, right? The idea being that no talent is never picked, right? I think at the end of the day, that's what I really mean, is that every talent should have its place. There should be a talent that, no matter, has some way that of being useful, and not in some super tiny 1% niche, right? There should be every talent should be usable in a good percentage of the gameplay, and have some degree of viability. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? I love to hear anything you have to say. Again, if you like this, give me a like. Dislike, give me a dislike. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. Again, Warriors, the next class I'll be doing. I'll be getting a bunch more class videos out here shortly. Again, going through all the Warriors, and then probably getting into actually some healers after that. So look forward to that, and hope to see you guys in my later videos.